Hey, all of you. Welcome to another video on AWS series. So today we are going to start a very big concept in AWS that is called VPC, right? So VPC, which stands for Virtual Private, sorry, that's a misspell, Virtual Private Network, right? So this virtual private network, what does it mean? What does it mean by network in general? So network stands for accessing the internet, right? So there are two types of network. One is internet and intranet, right? So virtual private network. So that means the virtual private network, which is provided as a service in AWS cloud. So that we call it as VPC. So instead of network, so here we are going to call it as cloud. So why? Because what AWS does is, AWS VPC does is, it isolates the entire cloud resources from different networks. Okay. So let's say you have two projects in your organization. So those two projects should have access to certain network, and each project network should be different, right? So they should not have the same networks. So that means their servers which are running for their application should not have the same IP address, right? So in that scenario, what we are going to do is AWS is going to offer a service for us. So that is virtual private network. And this virtual private network, we are going to see as a service which helps us to isolate the entire cloud resources in AWS. So what does it isolate? So what are the services that it can isolate, and why it is most useful, and how it works actually, what is its architecture? So all these things we will see in this series of video. So we will start from very basic to very advanced level of VPC concepts. So the very first concept that I'm going to start today is, what is VPC? So VPC, as I said, it's a virtual private network which isolates the cloud resources, right? Which isolates the cloud resources for different projects. So here, now because of this lockdown, everyone got familiarized with isolating, the word called isolation, right? So isolating is kind of separating. So separating and keeping it aside, right? So here, in the same way, VPC helps us to keep our cloud resources aside in a different network, right? So here, what are the key points that you need to identify? So in terms of network, right? So in AWS, so that is different. In terms of a network engineering, so that is different. So, but the underlying concept of networking is the same. So here, what we need to know is, we need to have an idea on certain keywords. So those keywords are subnets, right? And the other one is, which is very important, so that is CIDR block. So what do you mean by subnets? What do you mean by CIDR blocks? So first of all, what is an IP address? And we are going to discuss all these things in the coming videos. So today we are going to see a common building blocks of VPC. So what are the different building blocks of VPC? So how those building blocks are connected to each other to form a private cloud network, right? So here, what we are going to do is, let's see some building blocks of VPC. The very first building block of VPC is subnet, right? So subnet is the major building block of a VPC. You should have a separated network between one application to another application. So subnet is very important. And you should have a differentiation between the front end of the applications and the back end of the applications, right? So what front end comes into? So the user interface where the users are going to access. For example, you are going to the browser and you are accessing www.google.com. So that means you are getting an interface, right? So that interface is called front end. And the business logic which is lying behind the front end is called back end, right? So to isolate this front end and back end resources and to keep in a more secured way, we need subnets, right? So as we already know, AWS is divided into regions. right? AWS is divided into regions, and regions are again divided into availability zones, right? So in each availability zone, right, in each availability zone, we are going to deploy different subnets. So that point you have to keep in mind. So why in each availability zone we should have a separate subnet? So that we are going to discuss. So subnet relies on each availability zone. You can have number of subnets in the same availability zone, right? So you can have hundreds of public subnets and hundreds of private subnets in the same availability zone. In the same way, in different availability zones. So that's same thing. But at the end of the day, you are going to launch a VPC in a region. So that's you have to understand. So after subnetting, so right after subnets, what is the key point that we need to learn? So that is CIDR block. So the CIDR block, you need to identify how many servers is required for your application, right? So you know how big your application is, and you need to make a decision on how big your application is and how many number of servers that is required for your application. Either it might be front end or it might be back end, but you should have a clear idea about it. So to decide, and you have decided, okay, let's say you have decided I need 1,000 number of servers, right? So if you want to have 1,000 number of servers, so each server should be allocated with a private IP as well as a public IP, right? So if it is a backend server, it is allocated with a private IP. If it is a front-end server, it is allocated with a public IP. So to have that many number of IPs in your project, you need to declare the CIDR block, right? So that CIDR block, something it looks like 10./24. So this is a kind of format of a CIDR block, right? So the CIDR block consists of certain number of hosts, but we need to know how to calculate how to give a proper CIDR block based on our number of servers requirement, right? So that is the very important concept. And the other one, the other building block of VPC that we need to learn is NAT. So NAT is basically NAT internet. It's kind of an internet gateway which can route the request internally in the application, right? So it's kind of an intranet. You have two different kinds of concepts, right? Internet and intranet. So internet is external to your network and intranet is internal to your network. In the same way, NAT acts as internal network gateway, right? So now we have one more building block, so that is IGW. IGW is an internet gateway where you are going to access the internet from the browser, and that internet will be accessed on your public subnets, right? So these key points you have to be very much understandable. You have to be very thorough before starting and getting into a VPC. So now we know about the building blocks of VPC. Now let's see the architecture of VPC. So how VPC is framed and how these building blocks are connected to each other, and what is the workflow of an internet inside the VPC. So now let's jump into the architecture. Okay, so this is the architecture right in front of you, which you are seeing. This is the architecture of VPC, right? So don't get confused with a lot of building blocks here. At the end of the day, we have same building blocks. We have subnets, we have availability zones, we have internet gateways, and we have a NAT gateway, and we do have an internet which is accessible from the browser. So here, if you see, it is a VPC, this building block, this biggest plot that you're seeing is VPC. So inside VPC, of course, VPC is launched in a region, and inside VPC, you have availability zones. And these availability zone is having a name called 2A and 2B. And in each availability zone, you have a public subnet as well as you have a private subnet. And how these two are connected to each other? These two are connected with NAT gateway, right? So this is kind of an internal network which acts as a network between these two public and private subnets, right? Then how public subnets are accessing the internet from the browser? With the help of internet gateway. It is pretty simple. You don't, don't worry about this biggest diagram that you are seeing in front, but it is very simple. At the end of the day, the building blocks are subnet, availability zone, internet gateway, NAT gateway. So there is one more key point that I missed to add, that is called route table. So this is very, very important. So the route table is responsible for routing the request, right? So we'll discuss about the route table, what it is, how this is inserted in this building blocks, and how this is inserted in this architecture in the coming video. Okay, so that's all for this video, guys. I hope you all doing good. And if you like my content, thank you so much for subscribing my channel if you did. And if you're not, please do subscribe my channel and share it for your friends. Right? Thank you so much. Have a good day. Happy learning. Bye-bye.